Hi guys, welcome to COMP389 589 Lab Session 7. Today we're going to be building some database-driven web applications using PHP. Now, the reading for this practical is actually the PHP manual for PostgreSQL, so there's a whole range of documentation there for the PG Postgres libraries for PHP. If you're not familiar with PHP, you shouldn't be too worried because this prac is more like a demonstration, so you'll just be basically copying and pasting some code in and looking at the web pages that are produced by that one, just to give you an idea of how data-driven web apps actually interact with a database. So in today's practical session, you'll be building some database-driven web applications using PHP. You'll be building a simple web application for browsing our company database that we've been working on over the past few weeks in COMP389 589. As I mentioned before, you don't need to be familiar with the PHP scripting language. This practical is more of a demonstration than actually a problem-solving prac. But the stuff that you learn here can certainly be applied in your other work. And the main idea is to just give you a basic understanding of the operation of web-based applications. Now, just in our housekeeping session here, we're going to be connecting up to our database in a similar way to how we were when we were building Java applications that work with our database. So in order to connect your application to your database, you need to specify a username and a password. And the username and the password of the user that you want to connect to the database as. So to avoid having to use your UNE username and password in plain text within your programs, we've actually set up the apps users that you would have used back in practical number 4 when you build some Java data-driven web applications. So walk through this example here. This is exactly the same as what you saw in practical number 4, and basically it allows you to create a database. So you're going to be creating a practical an apps prac number 7 database for us to connect up to with our web-based application there. So run through that little session there. As I said, it's the same as what you were doing back in practical number 4. Basically, you're using your apps user to actually create a database for your application to connect up to. So go through and do that. And once you've done that, we want you to create the company database that we've been using all along. So you can go back through and load up your prac01.sql file that contains all of the schema, the data, the table definitions and data for the company database. So once you've done that, just run a dt command in the PSQL client just to double check that your apps database has all of the tables that we'd expect to see there. So we can move on to start looking at some exercises. So PHP is a very popular web scripting language. It allows programmers to rapidly develop web applications. There are numerous frameworks for building web applications that are built on top of PHP. Today we're just going to be using simple raw PHP code. We're not going to be wrapping it up in any sort of frameworks. And we're going to be using the PG library, the Postgres library that PHP provides to connect up to a PostgreSQL database to actually retrieve data from that. So in today's prac, you're only going to be retrieving data. You're not going to be creating new records in your database, and we're just going to give you an idea of what a data-driven web app can actually do. So in our first example, we're actually going to create a simple little web app that consists of two scripts for loading up employee details. So we're going to build 2 web pages. The first one is going to contain a HTML form that consists of a select list of the social security numbers and a submit button. So we're going to create this layout that we can see here, and I've already got that one implemented, so I'm going to bring that one up. So that one's P1 post. I load that one up. We can see here over on the left-hand side that I've got that page up straight away. The second the second script, which is p1.php, will actually display the employee's name. So the idea here is that we'll look up an employee number using our drop-down menu. Then we click our Get Employee get employee details button, and it actually returns the information from our database. So it does that dynamically. So if we select different employees, we of course get different results returned there. So we're going to walk through the code for that one. So here we have the PHP code for the P1 post script. So this code is relatively simple. Basically, we start off by including all of our usual HTML elements here. So we've got our HTML tag, our head tag with a title in there as well, and then we've got our body tag. So the body of a HTML page is where all of the actual content for the page goes. And you can see straight away we've actually dropped in some of these odd-looking tags with question marks in them. Now these are the PHP tags, and all of the PHP scripting code that you need to write actually goes between these tags. So the opening tag is just the, it looks like the top one there, it's just got the question mark PHP there, so you have to have the PHP in there as well. On Turing, on other implementations you can get away without having the PHP listed there, but in this particular situation you will. Then we go through, and in our code here, the first thing that we've got is we're defining our password, our username, and our database. Now, I've already substituted my username, database, and password for my apps account into the code that I'm executing here on Turing. So you need to go through and actually edit these 3 lines to include the details of your database and your apps user in there. So you have to include your database name, this third one down here, your username in the second, and in the first you need to include your password. It then goes on to create this connection string, and the connection string just stores all of the information that we need to connect up to our database, and it just builds it out of these, out of the password, username, and database that you've connected there. So it's very similar to the connection string that you've seen in the PSQL client that we've used before, and also in your Java database-driven web apps. We then call this PG connect function, and we return a database connection object from that function using our connection string. Then we can actually move down here and we can actually query our database. Now, we define our query. Our query is actually stored as a string. So this is literally our SQL query that we want to actually execute. And in this situation, we're just returning a list of the social security numbers. Now, the idea of this query is we're going to use this list to actually populate this drop-down menu that you can see over here on the left-hand side that I've got up there. So we go through and we actually run the PG query function. Now, the PG query function uses our query string that we've defined here. It goes through and executes that query on the database management system. So that query is sent through to the Postgres database that we've actually connected to already. And then it returns a result in this result variable. And we can actually go through, and we grab some more, we start off we actually stop our PHP tags here, and we go back to HTML. So here we're actually creating the heading, and we're also creating the form, the HTML form that we're going to actually put our select drop-down menu in. And then we go on and we loop through that result set using the PG fetch array function, and by item we go along and we actually include an item in the selection menu for each row of data that's returned in our result here. So basically we're using our PG fetch array to fetch an array of columns. In this situation there's only one column because we're only fetching the social security number, and we're using that to populate this option tag. So we've got option, our column value, which is going to be our actual attribute, so it'll be our SSN attribute that we're returning, and that creates the item in the drop-down list that we can see there. And then we finish up by including the submit button. So we're back down here, we end our PHP block of code, and we go back to our HTML, we code up our input button here, and then we set our form. So some important things to note about HTML. You can see here that the action on the form, so when we define the form, which contains both of these two widgets, the button, the submit button, and the drop-down menu, it'll actually send the results, it'll post the results through a HTTP post request to P1, to the script called p1.php. So you can see we can demonstrate that one when we select a particular employee's social security number here. We can get employee details and actually post it through to the p1.php script there. Now, so your task is to start by copying this code into a file with the name p1post.php. So you can do that using a text editor, and you need to save that file in your public HTML directory. Now, your public HTML directory just lives in your home directory on Turing. Now, if I just jump back into my Turing account, here we can see that when I bring up I open up a folder and I go to my home directory, so I'm already in my home directory. I've got all of these hidden files, but I actually have this public HTML directory as well. And if we go into here, it has lots of other scripts, but it's also got, that's where I've placed my P1 and my P1 post script in there. So you should be placing that one in your public HTML directory. Now, when you do that, when you create those files, other users other than yourself won't be able to access them. So you can see here, this is an example before I set up my my scripts. I haven't actually set up the permissions on them, so only I can actually read and write those PHP scripts. So P1 and P1 post here. I only have read and write access. Now, in order to actually execute them and actually have them come up as web pages and have them interpreted by the PHP interpreter, we need to give the PHP interpreter access to that, and we do that by actually just using the chmod command to actually give others and the users in the same group as myself access to read the file. So you can see once we've run this command, so we're adding read access to the other and group users to all of the PHP files there. When we list that one, they've got read access, and you'll be able to actually go and view the file then. So you can see there I've clicked on that link that I've provided there, and it goes through to my implementation of that one. So that's all that you need to do that step. So whenever you create one of these PHP scripts, it'll be created so that only you have permission to it, and you have to update the file permission so that the PHP interpreter can read that file and actually do something with it. So as we've seen, a PHP script typically consists of static HTML blocks. So you saw examples of that when we were setting up the form and setting up the employee details. And then there's dynamic parts that lie within the PHP tags. Now, in the above example script, the HTML page is produced, which has some static content such as the headers, and it has some dynamic content. So it uses it dynamically generates that select GUI element to contain that list of social security numbers. So it's querying the database to produce the list in our drop-down menu there. The P1 script, so the script the page responsible for displaying the employee details, is also very similar, only the main difference is actually in this first line of PHP code. So if we look here, we've got our usual arrangement of static code here to set up the head elements of our page, and we have our body element, and we create a static heading at the top. We then open up our PHP tags, and the first thing we do is actually go and retrieve the social security number. Now, recall that if we go back to our original form here, you can see that the method by which this form is submitting its data to the P1 script is actually through the post method. So it's sending through a HTTP post request containing all of the data from this form into the P1 script that we've got here. Now we need to retrieve that data, and we do so using this placeholder here. So you can see here we've got a macro, which is this post macro, and it actually goes and grabs the value for the variable named SSN, which is the name of our select widget. So we go back here, this select widget, which has our drop down information, is actually named SSN, and the value that we send through will be stored in this post SSN location, and we can retrieve that and then go and use that in our queries. So you can see here again we go through and connect up to our database in the same way as we did in the previous script, but in our query we're dynamically querying our database here. So we're actually dropping in our social security number that's been sent through to the script and using that to select all of the information about that particular employee. And then if we actually have any results returned, so we run our query using the pg query command, and then we use this pg fetch object command. Now the pg fetch object fetches the next object from the results set. So in this situation, there should only ever be one object returned. So we don't need to loop through our results set because there should only ever be 1 or 0 objects in there. So we can go and just fetch the data out of our results set using the pg fetch object one, and then we access the various elements in that data object. So the elements in there are going to have the same name as the columns in our database. So recall that the employee table, so we're querying the employee table and we're getting all of the attributes out of that employee table in our SQL query up here, which means that all attributes in the employee table are going to be available on this object that's returned by our pg fetch object function. So we can see here we're making use of the fname, middle initial, and lname attributes, and we can get the value of those ones using this arrow operator. So you can see we've got the dollar sign operator, $data, which is our object. We've got our arrow operator to grab the item indexed by lname. So we go through and we simply display that information on our page. So it's fairly straightforward. There's just a few functions there that we've introduced. So remember that when we're working in PHP, or if we want to access the value of our variables, we have a $sign in front of them. So if we want to assign a value to a variable, we place the $sign in front of it and we use the equals operator to assign a value. If we want to actually access data in an indexing structure, we use our arrow operator. So now you can see basically we're getting the hang of these PHP scripts. We're going to move on to some slightly more complex examples. The next one here actually demonstrates the use of a get parameter in the URL. So recall in our previous example here we were using a post parameter. So there's no additional data saved on the command line. When we submit that request, a post request is sent through to this P1 script, and the data is extracted out of the post request. We can implement similar behavior using a get request. So in a get request, the values, the data is actually appended after a question mark on the actual the URL for the page. So in this example here that we're calling P2, we're actually specifying the department number using a URL parameter called DNO or DNO equals 4. So we've got our parameter name, equal sign, and the value that we want to assign to that one. So in this example, all we're doing is displaying all of the employees for each department. So we can go through and demonstrate that one. So if we go to P2, where is it here? And we can go through and list all of the employees in department number 4. If we change our department name, we can get a different list of employees and so on. So we can list all of our employees for that particular department. So the code looks very similar again to our previous examples. So we've got our usual static HTML content up the top here. Then we've got our opening PHP tags. And the first thing we do is we go and grab that get parameter, that URL value that we've specified up here, and we do so using the underscore get macro that PHP makes available to us. And the name of the variable we want to get hold of is the DNO variable, and that's the one that the DNO value. So that's the one that we've specified up here, and we immediately assign that to a local variable in our script. And we go and we actually use that in our SQL query. So we're dynamically grabbing the employee information by department using our database query there. So so that allows us to dynamically generate that table. Now, So to dynamically generate our table, we actually revert back to some static code to set up all of the headings in our table. So we use our table tag to create a 2x2 table. We then specify the first row to contain our headings here. So the last name and the salary are our two headings. We do so using the table row or TR tags, and then we specify the two table heading tags using the TH tags there, and we set last name and first name. We then actually revert back to some PHP code here. We echo our employees in our department number, and we go through to actually create all of the rows in our table here. So you can see that we go through and we actually, using the result that we've got from our query function up the top here, we go through and using a while loop, we iterate through each object or each row of data that's returned in our result data set there. We assign those to some local variables, and we go and we actually print those out within the cells of the table. So we declare a row in our HTML table here for each row in our data returned, and we go through and actually insert the data items in there. So we insert the last name and the salary using little PHP PHP echo functions there. So you can see we're just simply dropping individual data values in amongst the static HTML code. So it works quite effectively for generating our tables there. So it's quite an interesting and tricky little thing to do there. So we've covered off on most of the basics here, and now we're going to move on and have a look at a little bit more of an advanced application that actually has multiple queries going on at once. So we're going to create a company database browser application. So the initial web page lists all of the departments in the company. By following hyperlinks, the user can see more information about departments, employees, and projects. So before we go on, I'm going to actually go and demonstrate this one. So we're actually going to a script called companybrowse.php. So if we go to companybrowse.php, it's a relatively simple script that just lists all of our departments, and it actually lists the department numbers as hyperlinks. So if you click on these, it actually goes to... Oh, we're in the wrong one. Sorry, guys. In my incorrect version. If we jump on in, we can actually see there, we can go to our department and employee tables there. So if we start off at our department of company table, we can then drill down into department information, so we can see the employees and projects linked with that department. So here we can drill into the individual employees, you can see projects they're associated with, you can drill into individual projects and see employees that are on projects. So there's quite a bit of information being displayed. So the first script that we're using in this browser is actually the companybrowse.php script. Now, company browse is very similar to the ones we've seen before. Basically, it just creates that list of links in the table there, and it does so by running this select query here to fetch a list of departments, and it actually orders them. So it gets the database to order them by the department number, and we create our table using our table tags, and we go through and actually echo our code into those, our statements into that table. So it's a fairly straightforward little script there. So the only tricky stuff is instead of actually creating we actually create hyperlinks for our numbers there. So there's just some tricky little HTML there that inserts the department number into another script. So those links actually link through to the department view script, and the department and links on here link to the employee view and project view scripts as well. So you can see there it's a fairly straightforward application. So the department view script that we saw before here actually lists all of the department information. So it lists the employees and the projects. The script for that one is very similar again, only it contains multiple SQL queries. So you can see here we're doing an initial query to grab the department and employee information. We're then grabbing project information as well there. So we do multiple lookups, multiple SQL queries, and populate multiple tables. So we're putting it together in a little bit more of a complex way. Again, we're using the same set of functions here. So the PG fetch object is the most common one that we use, and the PG query function to run our query. So we call PG query to execute our query that we specify using a query string in our database, and we use PG fetch object to actually extract the data out of that result object row by row. So if there are multiple rows, we need to extract an object for each row of data there and assign that to our values and actually go and print those out. So it's a fairly straightforward script, and it gives you the ability to load those pages up and present all of the employee information there. Similar script is also used for the project view.php and employee view.php scripts. So make sure you go through those in detail. So copy all of those pages here, these scripts, these pages and scripts that we've provided here to the files specified by the name there above each one. And make sure they're placed in your public HTML directory. So your public HTML directory should have a list of files that looks something like this list here once you're finished, and make sure that they're all readable by the other applications there, by the PHP interpreter. So that's all I've got for you today, guys. So just go through, get those going, browse through your through the company browser and have a play around, see if you can break it. And that's all we're going to cover off on today. If you have any questions about PHP, send them through. Otherwise, go and review the PHP documentation. You can see here we only actually use the connect, query, and PG fetch object functions. And the documentation does provide examples of their usage as well. So you've got some examples there of using the PG fetch object function. If you have any general queries about PHP, you can also go to the PHP general documentation site as well there. So that's just a really quick introduction to data-driven web applications using PHP. You won't have to produce these in your exams. It's just to give you a bit of an overview of how these can actually be used to build dynamic web pages. So thanks for listening, guys. See ya.